Thank you for being here and not Netflix and chilling. Like, that's appreciative. And thank you, Remind, for having me. So as Nancy said, let's hope this works and that I can operate technology. I'm giving a crash course on diversity, equity, and inclusion in an attempt to create more intentional designers. But before I want to begin, in an effort to not continue to erase the history of Indigenous people that had their existence nearly wiped out by colonizers, I want to recognize that we are standing on Ohlone territory. I encourage you to look up how beautiful and complex this set of tribes was, and just continue to educate yourselves on this history that's largely erased. With that being said, hi, my name's Alexis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a designer at Splunk with a passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the tech space. Now, for those who don't know what Splunk is, I encourage you to grab your sunglasses and go check out the Montgomery Street BART station. That's us. But actually, we're a tech company that simplifies machine data with a processing language and then helps visualize and organize it. Specifically, I work on Splunk Investigate, which is a software as a service tool that helps modern application development teams troubleshoot and monitor their environments. I also work on culture building on a hypergrowth design team and participate in employee resource groups. A tagline that we have at Splunk is 1 million data points. And when you look at mine, honestly, I feel like DE&I was ingrained in my life. I'm an only child to an immigrant mother and a US-born father. I'm first generation to finish high school and a 4-year college within 2 generations of my family on both sides. I graduated from Stanford with a product design engineering major and a theater minor, so really understanding empathy from all sides. I'm also a volunteer at Inneract Project, which is a nonprofit hi guys, dedicated to serving Black and Latinx middle schoolers and help teach them about design opportunities. Jihern's going to talk about Inneract later today, so near and dear to my heart. And lastly, I'm part of Inneract Dance Academy, which is the first queer, trans, and ally Latin dance academy in the US. So we're tackling things in my life from social inequality, access, gentrification, anti-Blackness, queerphobia, decolonialization, list goes on. Pretty lucky that I can to help Splunk's mission of making data accessible, usable, and valuable to everyone. But how can you do that in a system that remains largely ignorant to all of its unconscious biases? If you think about our leadership and most tech leadership and most customers who consume tech, it's largely Western-centric. It's largely male-dominated. It's largely meant for white folks. So my proposition and challenge to all of you is that we need to treat the disease, not just the symptoms of that disease. And in order to do this, we need to recognize our own biases, whether they're conscious, unconscious, or systematic. So we'll break this down into 4 parts. Part 1 is a bit of education. Part 2 is examples that you've heard before at like every generic DE&I talk. So we'll zoom through those. And then move on to part 3, which is kind of like beyond the usual, some more, and then I'll wrap up. All the examples I'm going to use are from things that I've learned at Splunk or that my colleagues have learned. So hoping that learn and continue to be DE&I champions in your organizations. So let's get educated, shall we? And I'm going to note that it's free this time. But I'm going to preface this with a warning. I'm about to make some folks extremely uncomfortable in this audience. And I encourage you to lean into that discomfort because acknowledgement is the first step to moving forward for a better world. So here's an example of a common analogy of DE&I, and there are honestly too many sources that said X person said this, so I didn't want to source the wrong person. But it's diversity is getting invited to the dance, inclusion is getting asked to dance. And I added equity because that's super important. Equity, in example that I looked up, is making sure your music's being played. I also add that maybe you want to add a sliding scale to the dance to make up for people who are not as high of socioeconomic status. Or you may want to include free transportation for those who don't have the money to buy a car or don't have the means to fix it and get there where they need to go at the moment. So while you can pat yourself on the back for diversity, if you don't offer any inclusion practices, honestly, that's kind of useless. Inclusion is how you retain BIPOC, QTPOC folks in your company. And you can relieve D&I efforts by looking at equity. I also want to take a note to mention the definitions of privilege and oppression. So while privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted to a particular group, oppression is a process by which historically a certain group continues to be excluded and they're offered less access to society's benefits and resources. One thing that I'll want to note is that oftentimes we'll see folks in a position of power or privilege step into a space that can be occupied by underrepresented minorities or oppressive groups, and they themselves feel oppressed. Makes them uncomfortable. That makes sense. However, that's not oppression. It's actually called othering. So say, for instance, you attend a school and you're able to hear a school for the deaf. You may feel that the school's not built for you, that it makes you uncomfortable. However, once you step off the lines of those campus, you return to your position of privilege right away. And we need to recognize that some folks don't ever get that opportunity to be in a position of privilege. So why do I tell you all this? Well, text diversity, equity, and inclusion examples and blunders with products are not out of goodwill or accident. They're out of a result of forms of oppression that are finally being reprimanded and have consequences. Take, for example, Domino's, who got sued by the Supreme Court, got their case taken to the Supreme Court by someone and lost. I heard their response was, well, blind people don't need to order pizza online, which don't say that. But what does oppression look like in that case in a US Western-based context? And I include this diagram for you. This is from Visions Consulting, really great. And they mentioned that at the group level, this is where privilege and oppression live. Guess what your organizations and companies that you work for are? Group level. So this is something that's caught and taught. Leadership brings in their values, ideas as the individual and proceeds to disperse that to the group. How we see that bubbled up is in racism, classism, heterosexism, and other topics that I'm going to dive into. Now, I could spend like hours talking about this. This is like my bread and butter. But instead, I want to recommend you to my mentor and really great fellow designer, creative director, Tatiana Mack. She has a great talk called How Privilege Defines Performance and Perspective. And she's been doing some really great work in this space. So please look her up. She's awesome. And last but not least, pro tip, pay people money to educate you. It is not the responsibility of your underrepresented friends or your oppressed friends to educate you for free. Think about their emotional labor. Think about them. There's a bunch of consultants in the Bay Area. I particularly like Awaken, Vision Consulting, and Paradigm. And then I take Venmo and PayPal if you want to come talk to me later. So let's move to part 2. I'm going to go kind of blaze through this because Shabi gives some really great examples 2 days from now. So let's talk about ableism, which is favoring able-bodied neurotypical people versus people with a physical, mental, emotional, learning disability. Common examples include vision impairment. So if you haven't heard of WCAG, definitely recommend. Or checking if anyone's openly colorblind in your organization. That one's a really good one because you can generate empathy, and who knows, it may end up being a product leader for all you know. In terms of motor impairment, something that we really learned at Splunk was not disabling pinch to zoom on mobile. We build really complex dashboards. This is an example from our data viz team about airlines. And we thought, who would ever want to view this on their mobile phone? Because it's just so complex. Turns out every person who gets a mobile alert has to view this dashboard on their phone. So lesson learned from that. And we also acknowledge that it's hard to do screen readers on data visualization. So that's something that our team is working on at Splunk. Now, tools for usage, they don't have to be expensive. It's easy as a right click to get started. So WebAIM has a screen reader simulation if you want to check that out. I also highly recommend Google Lighthouse, which is done through Inspect. You can go ahead and audit and then look at your website in terms of accessibility and performance. And again, I bring this up because Splunk does still have a long way to go, and we're working on it. Next, a really quick one is sexism and genderism. So that's favoring male over female identifying folks, or favoring cisgender folks over transgender, gender nonconforming, gender queer, and androgynous folks. If you had no idea what I just said, highly recommend looking at the Gender Unicorn. That's going to teach you a lot, or the Bill Nye the Science Guy episode on Netflix about gender identity and the spectrum. So one lesson that we've learned from Splunk, and I say this with examples of products that I've had to use during my time there, is poor gender representation and practices. And I beg to ask you, do you really even need to mention gender in your product? So Splunk recently got rid of gender because we decided no. Why should we worry about your gender when all you want to do is look at your data? So let's move beyond the usual. You're going to impress your design friends. I really love looking at linguistic oppression. So this is favoring English-speaking users over ESL and non-English speakers. Aiden's actually going to give a really good example from Remind, and I'm going to give a few from Splunk. So one thing I like to mention is getting lost in translation, and Google Translate is not always right. We recently learned that our APAC customers were confused at why when they were looking at developer documentation, that when we really meant this button, which is the CTA call to action, it was translating as a shirt button. And that was really awkward and embarrassing for us. So when we learned that non-EMEA regions were unhappy with our translation of our documentation and what was in the product, we realized that we had to invest in bringing in a new cultural perspective and experience into our own local operations. And instead of relying on translating and our own assumptions, we wanted to create the solution with the lenses that we needed in-house. So happy to say we've been able to bring in new perspectives to the team. And one thing I'll also ask you in terms of linguistic oppression is, does your product look at Latin scripts only or all scripts? We learn at design school from a Western perspective that a hierarchy is supposed to go left to right and up to down. But looking at things like Arabic and Hebrew scripts and traditional Chinese and kanji, that's not the way that all your products work. And when you start looking at translation, you also need to be wary of line heights. Are your symbols all mashing together, or are you actually building a quality experience for every language? And W3 has a really good chapter on internationalization if you'd like to learn more about that. Lastly, I'm going to give you the story about Bjorn, and it's my favorite story to date working as a designer at Splunk. So I met Bjorn last year at our user conference in Orlando. He's a champion of our product. He's part of the Splunk Trust team, and he's just an extraordinary guy. So he found me working at our user conference this year, and we got to chat for a bit. And he said, I need to speak to a product person. I'm like, well, I'm a product person. What do you want to learn? And he gave me this sheet of paper. And he told me, this is how many times my name has been rendered on emails from your product. Because he has an umlaut in his name, which is, he's German, so that's a common symbol that's used. But if you can't render a customer or user's name right, what are you doing as a designer, as a champion? So this is something that we're actively fixing. We're probably going to make him a shirt, so maybe that'll kind of fix things. So on top of linguistic oppression, I also want to mention ageism and elitism, because this is something that's not really talked about. So ageism is, by definition, favoring adults over elders, which elders defined as 40 plus by the law. I don't make the rules, sorry. Children and young adults. And elitism is favoring formally educated people, managers, and faculty over informally educated, clerical, non-exempt people, including students. So two things I'll bring up working at Splunk that I've recently realized is, look at your product strategy. Is there a lack of inclusion there? Is there oppression there? Because your own product strategy can hold oppression. And I talk about this because we offer two main methods of Splunk, which is enterprise and software as a service. When you think about the nature of enterprise, you need to have a lot of financial backing to run. You need to have a lot of on-prem servers, people to run them, people to maintain them. Typically, you need a 4-year education or more to operate all of that machinery and code. And that's not cool. So I'm pretty lucky and I feel grateful to be working on Splunk Investigate, which is as easy as getting a free trial, throwing in a credit card, and now you have access to this product. However, it's never that easy. And one thing that our customers talk about is that SPL, which is Splunk Processing Language, can be really difficult to learn. And they might not have time or the education or access in order to do that. So we can suggest features into the product strategy that relieve that. So this is an example of our natural language processing, NLP. And essentially what this does is enables people to search their data without having to know an SQL and Unix-based language. And how many more people, like students and those without a college degree or education, can we reach? And how much more diverse can our hiring get if we have people who have used the product, who come from non-traditional backgrounds? So here's some examples of just moving beyond what we call the usual. I'm almost done, sorry. So I've given you all this information, and what are you gonna do with it? So one, first and foremost, educate yourself. There's a lot that we don't know because while we are the own unique permutation of our experiences, there's everyone else around us who has just as much as a complex life. So I encourage you to ask folks, read books, Google search, do whatever you can in order to learn about people who aren't like you. Next is start small. You can't change a company's product strategy overnight, but you can maybe start offering gender pronouns on your team or bring up reasons why we're doing things that may oppress a certain group of people. The third is being able to translate that need. Why I say this is because a mentor said, wow, this presentation is pretty pessimistic. And instead of going into a meeting and saying like, this is linguistic oppression, I can also reframe it as we need to open ourselves up to a brand new market. And in order to create a seamless experience and gain and retain more happy customers, which helps revenue, we need to be more mindful of how our product is being translated into different languages. Thinking of natural language processing. It's a new feature that opens us up to an entirely new market and helps visual and motor impaired people as well. I don't have to use my eyes. I don't have to use my hands. I can use my voice. So sometimes you can get often many underrepresented and oppressed groups with a feature. And I'll recommend also just learning business values. What's the revenue of what a feature A can look like compared to feature B? Can you weigh that against the cost revenue of what it takes to build it? And these are the things that can get other stakeholders outside of your design department or any department you're on engaged. Find allies. This is super important. You cannot be in every single meeting with your product or a strategy. However, you can have people who are your ears and eyes, and they can go ahead and advocate for you when you're not in the room. I also recommend looking at your company and seeing if there's employee resource groups or ERGs who can help you kind of illuminate the oppression and the lack of privilege that people face day to day. However, don't make the assumption that they will, and recognize the emotional labor that they're putting forth by doing so. And lastly, breathe. This work is really hard because it's not often the priority of companies, and it can be emotionally and mentally exhausting. But I really encourage you to hang in there because somewhere out there, someone's thanking you, and that's why we design for inclusion. Thanks.
Amazing job. Thank you so much, Alexis. I have been admiring her. I remember I awkwardly went up to her. I was like, I've known you since you introduced yourself at a Latinas in Tech event, and now I'm asking you to speak at our company. So yes, she's amazing. Thank you so much. So up next is Jihern. He's going to share with us the benefits of building ties with your local community. So give it up for him.
Thank you. Okay, it's showing. Oh, okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Truly felt like the support I've always needed in my life. Full disclosure, I am super nervous right now. And it's actually a little wild that I made it out tonight because I realized just as I get older, how much I hate talking. But as it'll be made apparent in just a moment, you gotta do it for the kids. So with that very obnoxious introduction, my name is Jihern, and I'm a product designer at a company called Thumbtack, which is a local services marketplace. I have a few coworkers back there. Appreciate their support. I also moonlight as a programs and education lead at a nonprofit organization called Inneract Project, which is more formally the reason why I was invited to speak tonight. Just by a quick show of hands, how many folks here have heard of Inneract Project? Okay, a good mix. I think my work here is done. For those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, Inneract Project is a nonprofit that offers free design education to local underrepresented youth in hopes of introducing and connecting them to viable career paths in design. And we do this by offering structured programs that introduce students to various design disciplines and that help them build and refine foundational design skills. Things like design thinking, having a growth mindset, collaboration, giving and receiving feedback. The list is pretty extensive. But as an organization, we're composed of 2 full-time employees and a small handful of very dedicated volunteers. This is just my way of saying that we're pretty bootstrapped as an organization, and we hustle after work and on weekends. And honestly, it's pretty tough trying to fully realize the work that we're trying to set forth. But We're present and we're in the business of doing something about the problems that afflict communities that traditionally have not had access to opportunity. So on that note, I'm here tonight to share some of the lessons that my team has learned in doing this work while in the classroom. But what I'm really hoping to convey is that these insights aren't just relevant to the things that Inneract Project is doing. In the current state of diversity or lack thereof, I think all companies need to invest in longer-term community-based initiatives to create equitable, authentic, and sustainable pathways that will ultimately lead to more diverse teams and more inclusive products. So in that pursuit, I think that these lessons will ultimately prove to be quite invaluable. Now, I joined Inneract Project almost 3 years ago, which is just, time flies. I started as a teaching assistant for one of our flagship programs, and soon after was asked to help transition one of those programs to move away from curriculum that historically centered around graphic design principles and towards lessons around design thinking. And it was through this transition that we realized our first lesson for the evening. Design programs intentionally for students. Now, I know this is a pretty obvious one, but it's just another how easy it is to lose sight of the bigger picture when you're working at such a low level. And so for us, after piloting these curriculum changes, and just a quick note, this is just kind of a snippet of one of our curriculum frameworks, and we create curriculum frameworks for each of our programs. You'll see that it's broken out by week. We have topics that we introduce every week. After we implemented this, we realized that students had no difficulty understanding the concept of design thinking, but they really struggled to extrapolate the vast applications of this methodology and its relevance to solving problems in their own communities. And so we realized that this was an outcome of not doing more to expose our students to the different applications of design. And so in response, we ended up releasing a brand new program that focused on introducing students to the breadth of design discipline first and foremost. And so what you're seeing up here is actually the curriculum framework for one of our first introductory programs that we launched, I want to say 2 years ago. It's now the very first program that our students go through before they enter into the program that talks a little bit more about design thinking. Now for our next lesson, we've learned since the importance of empowering students to drive their own learning. And this particular lesson can be exemplified by the annual design-a-thon that we host each year during San Francisco Design Week. More specifically, we partner with companies like Google, Adobe, and eBay, and we bring our students into professional environments with real professionals to solve real design challenges. And so this year we tackled the following prompt: how might we help homeless youth find local services? Now, we landed on this after surveying our students about topics that we're passionate about and familiar with. And for us, it's so important that we invest our time and energy in understanding our students and where their interests lie, because the intersection of their knowledge and culture manifests into challenges like these. They're also used to create curriculum centered around topics that resonate with our students. And by enabling students to influence their own program experiences, we see that they become more engaged in learning, doing, and are often validated in their own potential. Now, in addition to contextualizing design in what students learn, we teach design by bringing students into real design spaces, which brings us to this particular lesson, Teach Design in Context. As I just mentioned, we partner with major corporations for annual design-a-thon. So this year we partnered with Google, Adobe, and eBay. In the past, we partnered with Amazon, Collins, and Adobe. And so these companies show our students what it means to design in a space that embodies technological innovation, cross-functional collaboration, and industry leadership. And for many of our students, these experiences show them what it looks like to be in a real professional environment, which many of our students don't have a lot of experience around. And in that process, things start to click for them because they realize that there's space for them in the tech industry and that they belong and that they're welcome here. Finally, we recognize the importance of investing long-term and unconditionally. The majority of students who participate in our program start their journey in middle school, and this is intentional as we recognize the importance of time and reinforcement in building a pathway to design. To that extent, this often runs counter to the immediate recruiting channels that companies seek when partnering with us, but we maintain a strong belief that long-term investment creates more equity and opportunity and helps drive a more sustainable way to build diverse teams. So with that, our goal is inextricably tied to the health of our local communities of color. That is, our goal is not to demand more of our younger Black and Brown generations. Rather, it's to empower our students to develop skills, enable them to solve any problem, to explore all possible career paths, and to savor their youth in a community that can only thrive with them in it. In that approach, we know they'll be well equipped to enter any industry that desperately needs their unique perspectives and voices. So I recognize that these learnings might feel distant and disjointed at this very moment, but as I mentioned at the very beginning of this, I want to share these insights so as to set forth foundations for you all to take back to your teams and your companies. And the reason being is that the tech industry is not very diverse, and we know this. The question then becomes, what is recruiting for diversity but tokenism? When our approach is to hire underrepresented minorities so as to cross off another item on our checklist, it's hard to say that we're moving and advancing in the most meaningful ways possible. So in my mind, the ways in which we combat tokenism is to add another tactic to our multi-pronged approach in building equity, diversity, and inclusion. Specifically, we need to invest in pathways to design and tech for local underrepresented communities. And in doing so, we begin to signal that we're part of this community and that we're present. So what can we do as individual contributors, as leaders, as companies? Start by having the conversation. Talk about how your strategies for diversity and inclusion need to be paired with longer-term programs that help us move away from tokenizing practices and that build equitable pathways to our companies. In doing so, we begin the process of creating sustainable pipelines to build diverse teams and inclusive products. With organizations like Inneract Project, there's also a long list here, and there's no shortage of nonprofits that exist in the Bay Area. There are also tons of local institutions like public libraries or community centers. If you learn what offerings exist, you can avoid recreating the wheel and help shape what exists to be even better and create more access to tech. Finally, offer external mentorship, whether that's through a program that your team creates or through a nonprofit, or one that you begin as a member of the community. Just start something, anything. What you create might end up becoming an invaluable opportunity for communities that haven't had the same opportunities that you and I have had. And as you think about how you and your teams might invest more into a community, remember that you already have a few lessons under your belt. To design programs intentionally for students, to empower students to drive their own learning, to teach design in context, and to invest long-term. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I definitely echo checking out Inneract Project if you're a designer and want to work with them. Aiden and I got a chance to go to their fundraising event, was truly inspired by the work that they do, and they got to raise enough money to have their own space. So their work is definitely making an impact in the community. All right, so next is Shabi, and she's going to tell us about the work that she does for building for people with disabilities.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Remind, for having me. So I am Shabi Kashani, and before I dig in, I wanted to share a little bit about myself. So I am a proud Puerto Rican Persian from the South, and I mean deep South. The South, where conformity is essential to making friends, and oftentimes individuals don't really even know how to interact with you because you simply look different. So when I began my career, I was extremely curious about human behavior to understand why we as society act the way we do. But coming from an artistic background, I ultimately went into design. So fortunately, user experience marries anthropology and design because it aims to make technology easy for everyone to use by understanding the challenges that we face. However, when I started studying UX at SCAD, any SCAD grads, I realized much of what we learned was biased towards the able-bodied average person, and little thought was given to minorities. So ultimately, we excluded diverse communities altogether. So slowly, I began designing for people with vision impairments, and then I interned in the healthcare field to support people with motor impairments, and then finally joined Google as a part of the accessibility team as an interaction designer. And over the last year, I switched from accessibility into assistant auto to prevent casualties due to distracted driving by applying an inclusive design framework. So I'm here today to share with you the framework that I developed over the past year through the mistakes that I made over time. So let's dig in. According to a study done by Gloria Mark, a professor of informatics, we switch tasks every 3 minutes. Research also uncovered that we swap devices 21 times within an hour. Not only are we constantly multitasking, but we continue to flip-flop from one device to another. This forces our minds to become scattered due to the attention shifting and device switching behavior. Therefore, design becomes a moving target where our solutions don't stick or sustain over time. And when we have difficulty focusing, our behaviors start to resemble those with ADD. Attention deficit disorder is marked by persistent symptoms to inattention. And personally, I've even realized within my own behaviors that I've become more distracted by technology more than ever before. So the fact that our minds and our attention are constantly limited is especially critical when we need to focus longer than 3 minutes, especially for cognitively intense tasks, such as when we're driving. So whether you've realized it or not, we've all experienced some form of impairment within our lives, and you might have encountered one today. Driving especially puts us in a situation that affects our cognition because our minds simply have limited bandwidth. Likewise, when we've stayed up all night, our cognitive function is just not as acute as it normally is. And both of these scenarios compare to someone, to the difficulty that someone with attention deficit disorder has with focus. And I think it's worth mentioning that there are many different spectrums like this for other impairments, such as vision loss or limited hearing. So this is where learning from best practices around designing for people with disabilities becomes fundamental for creating useful experiences for all of us. So when you hear accessibility principles in the context of driving, you might think of enlarged font, high contrast, and ultimately a simplified interface. This is because accessibility design aims to minimize the mismatch between one's ability and their environment. So we could think of the quintessential UX mantra, it's not the user's fault, but rather it's the situations and environments that we find ourselves in. But in order to close the gap, you need to understand the context that might lead to these mismatches. So this is where accessibility is the core of inclusive design because it inherently considers a wide range of human diversity. And human diversity alludes to social, cultural, racial, and other implications, therefore casting a large net that supports a unique set of needs and environments specifically for minorities. So when you hear from a diverse set of users, you can apply those insights to create useful system adaptations. So to illustrate this more concretely, let's look at Spotify's new Bluetooth-enabled car view. So car view designs around the limits to sight and cognition while driving and using a very small mobile device by yielding an adaptive interface that, once again, considers the device, environment, and the needs of people. And it does so by enlarging the font and control sizes and removing anything else that doesn't serve the user's primary task of driving. So in this case, they've removed the album art that we're used to seeing every day. Okay, so how can we be like Spotify and design adaptive experiences? Well, if you've been with me this far, we design with an inclusive framework. So here are the key principles that I learned along the way. First, prioritize the needs of people with disabilities in order to inform the content and modified system behaviors. So upon joining Google, I was ready to employ human-centered design. And I had a simple task of just redesigning an outdated site. That's super easy for a new grad designer, right? Especially when the site looked like it was made by an engineer during the dot-com boom. No offense, I love you engineers. All I had to do was clean up the information architecture and improve the glanceability through enhanced visuals and typefaces through headings. So let's face it, like most people don't actually want to read, right? We just gotta clean it up. Wrong. Some people with limited vision solely intake information through systems that read aloud the content on the screen, otherwise known as a screen reader. So there's no such thing as an average user. And I had unknowingly disregarded the mental model of people with limited sight. And because my biases assured me that I was making the site overall generally better, but in reality, I completely reduced the usability for users that relied on screen readers. So the pretty images that made for this glanceable experience for sighted users created an extremely inefficient experience and noisy experience for screen reader users. So if you have any decorative images in your interface, you want to ensure that they are hidden unless they provide useful information to users. In this case, we would want to insert alternative text, which is a simple description of what the image describes. Otherwise, the screen reader begins to sound like cute puppy, fluffy cat, when the user is just trying to understand how to care for their pet, for example. So next, the headings that I use in the site gave me this unwarranted confidence to actually learn something in my typography class, but no, it turns out that I just had false hope. And I naively threw off the taxonomic structure of the site for screen reader users, especially since the typefaces that I was using were comprised of semantic HTML. So to elaborate, there are various types of treatments for text for visual scanning, so different fonts for sighted users, but there are also different heading levels for non-sighted users. So this is typically seen as H1, H2, which means just heading 1, heading 2. And heading 1, for example, is typically the title of the interface, and it can be hidden to the visual eye. And this is to help screen reader users build a mental model of the site's information architecture. So any heading underneath that, so for example, heading 2 or heading 3, is how nested the element is. So any succeeding heading is how nested the element is. So to further elaborate, let's take a quick look at this video. This is Mac's screen reader, which is called VoiceOver, and this is the rotor. So oftentimes screen reader users will pull up the rotor to quickly navigate an interface through headings. And you might notice that the headings are hidden, like the heading 1 is hidden in this example. So you can't see any bounding box here. And then heading level 3 is what we see as our main search result titles. And anything nested below is just a lower heading. So because I didn't really consider the heading hierarchy in my designs, I ended up convoluting the information architecture and user's mental model, which misled people to think that there was more nested content than there actually was. So this ultimately led to an inefficient experience because screen reader users rely on those headings to quickly navigate in the UI. And obviously this was the stark opposite of my intentions. So as you can tell, my product initially failed to meet users' needs and adapt appropriately, especially outside of my own mental model. And this was simply just because I wasn't applying an inclusive framework. So next, it's important to think about multiple modes of interaction to support a wide range of input and output modalities. But the amount of input and output modalities for people with disabilities can be indefinite and extremely daunting, if you can't tell. But fortunately, the programmatic behavior of the keyboard is inherited by the screen reader, which is a software that verbalizes the content on the screen. Also, the keyboard feeds into switch devices, which is seen in the second image, or third, sorry, as a 2 or more button interface. That one button typically navigates the interface similar to a keyboard tab. And then the other button selects whatever is highlighted. So that would be done through the keyboard using the Enter key. And then finally, the keyboard feeds into the Braille display because essentially the Braille is a keyboard that can input and output Braille. However, all of these assistive technologies share the same goal of limiting key presses and providing efficient navigation for users. So in order to achieve limited key presses, the traversal order of your UI needs to present vital information early on, and you also just need to really heavily consider what are the core tasks in order to design that traversal order for users, especially since people are relying on different input and output modalities. So I learned this when I was working on a new feature, and this time it wasn't just an internal site. And an aspect of this feature allowed a user to see an image, and below the image, there were additional previews of other images. So as seen in the wireframe on the screen. So I kept exploring iterations of the original layout because I can tap the screen. But this meant it took users with switch inputs and screen readers double the time to change the image in focus, so the big image, because they needed to traverse, and just to clarify what that means, just move their focus beneath the main preview. So they would tab stop or key press once, twice, and then a third time. So 3 presses to get to the last image as opposed to just a single finger tap. So since assistive technologies are interrelated, the verbalization by the screen reader was also unintuitive. And this was because theoretically the image in focus would say image 10, and then the following image would say image 10 out of 20. So this increased noise and redundancy while reducing efficiency, and our main goal is efficiency. However, now that I work a lot with conversational designers on Assistant Auto, it's necessary to provide the most important query and information for cognitively dense content last. So currently, we're trying to understand how we might readapt the input and communication with the assistant when someone is driving. So how do we move from a tap forward experience to more voice prompt forward, especially when we need to consider the most vital information comes last. So this is where multimodal experiences like speech to text become useful, especially when we're just feeling lazy, or maybe we're actually busy and our hands are full driving. And this is really important considering we swap devices 21 times in an hour. So therefore, as designers, we need to begin thinking in systems. Particularly since people with disabilities oftentimes don't have too many options as to which devices or input methods are suitable for their abilities. So while working on Assistant, I've learned how the Assistant manifests itself on many different devices that leverage IoT technology to ultimately support people's needs, whether they're in a temporary limiting situation or maybe they have a permanent disability. So let's look at how my colleague Patrick uses Assistant's IoT capabilities to control his home more easily.
Using the Google Assistant provides much needed accessibility. Smart lights are another category of devices that you can control using your Google Assistant. For example, I can say, "Okay, Google, turn on the living room lights."
Sure, turning 3 lights on.
We're using Philips Hue lights for this demo, but there are a wide range of lights that the Google Assistant supports. I also happen to have the Nest Hello video doorbell and a Nest Aware subscription. Using the Nest app, I can assign names to faces and will recognize people as they approach. My Google Assistant on Google Home will tell me who's at my door.
Kieran is at the door.
That's my colleague Kieran. Since I have a smart door lock, I can unlock my front door using the Assistant as well. Okay, Google, unlock the front door.
Can I have your security code to unlock the front door?
2035.
His code after that. Okay, so now if we combined Assistant's IoT technology with something like Google Routines, we've effectively reduced the input down to just a single command, which becomes super efficient for people with disabilities. And the Assistant ecosystem is a prime example for how design can fight against ableism and privilege, as Alexis gave a great explanation to. So needless to say, a useful solution starts with an inclusive design framework, one that adapts to our needs when we're in ever-changing and limiting environments. But to do so, we should prioritize the needs of people with disabilities, support multimodal input and output modalities, especially when we're flip-flopping between devices, and then finally, think in systems to provide a unified and reliable experience. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to have Aiden speak, and he's going to talk about the work that we're doing here at Remind.
Hello. All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Aiden. Oh, I'm kind of going out there. Okay. Is the audio? Okay, there we go. Hey, everybody. How's it going? My name is Aiden. I am a product designer at Remind. And tonight I'd like to share a few stories. Oh, I'd like to share a few stories about, is this mic on? I'm getting some feedback here. I'm going to share a few stories about how we address bias to make Remind a more inclusive product. And my hope is that by showing you our process, you'll reflect on your own and look for opportunities to make your product more inclusive. So to start, I'm just curious, who here knows what Remind does? Just a show of hands. Okay, so we've got maybe like 25%. Welcome, this is Remind. No one did their homework. No, I'm just kidding. This is what Remind does. So it's a communication platform. It's used by over half the country's teachers to communicate with their students and parents. We were founded 8 years ago by two brothers, Brett and David. And they started Remind to help facilitate relationships between teachers, parents, and students. Our hypothesis is that those relationships are key to student success. And so when we talk about designing for inclusion, to me, there are three main questions to think about. And I'm going to answer each of these for Remind, but I want you to be thinking about what your answers are for your company or your product. So the first is mission. What are you trying to achieve? For us, it's to give every student the opportunity to succeed. And that word every is very important in the next point, which is about audience. So for us right now, we're focused on the US, and our audience is everybody that's connected to the education system in the US. That's students, parents, and educators, teachers, and administrators. This third question is a little bit more tricky. It talks about what sort of inequities might your product be able to address. And I think a lot of folks get overwhelmed by the idea of eliminating all bias from their product, right? We've heard about there's just so many things to think about, and it can be overwhelming. So I think a simple question to start is to think, what is your product uniquely positioned to address? So Remind, we're an education and communication platform. So the areas of inequity that I'm going to talk about tonight have to do with technology and language. So let's start with technology. So I own a smartphone. Everyone on my team owns a smartphone, and everyone in my family owns a smartphone too. It's easy to think, okay, basically everybody in the US has a smartphone, right? It's true that 96% of folks in the US have a cell phone, but only around 81% of people have smartphones. So that's a huge gap. So if we're designing a smartphone app, and our goal is to reach every student, how do we design for that? So we've built Remind in a way that doesn't require a smartphone to use. This investment in sending text messages gets us closer to our vision of giving every student an opportunity to succeed, not just folks with smartphones. But inclusivity is not a checkbox. That's the name of this talk. And we don't get to pat ourselves on the back and say, great, we send texts, we are inclusive, it's done. There's still so many other folks that are being left out. And that brings us to language. So the vast majority of our users are in the US. And Remind is overwhelmingly in English. So our interface is in English, our help center is in English, our marketing materials are in English. But the reality is that only 78% of families in the US speak English at home. So what does that look like in the classroom? It means that English language learning parents aren't getting the same resources as their English speaking counterparts. It also means that there can be low turnouts for parent-teacher conferences if parents don't feel like their teachers are going to be able to understand them when they come in. So this is a huge opportunity for Remind to be that connective fabric between folks that normally wouldn't be able to communicate is a huge opportunity. And this is the sort of project that makes me really excited to work here. So I want to share a little bit about what we did. So 4 years ago, we connected Remind to the 90+ languages in Google's translation API, so that anybody sending a message, they could translate it into one of those 90 languages. And this had an immediate impact on the types of communication that happened on Remind. So we heard from folks like Efrain Tovar, and he's in Central Valley, California, and he doesn't speak Arabic, but he used Remind to build relationships with parents in Arabic. So his community is full of folks that have recently moved to the US, and he's able to give them an opportunity to get involved with their kids' learning. So this is a huge win for giving every student the opportunity to succeed. But again, I'm going to keep repeating this, inclusivity is not a checkbox. So in the past 4 years, we've gotten a lot of feedback from users that's shown us that Remind's translation feature has some space to grow. It can be even more inclusive. And I found this image on Google that I think really demonstrates some of the ways that our translation feature falls short. And it has a story with it. So imagine there's this guy in a town, and he learns that the Pope is coming to his town to visit. He's super excited. He makes this huge sign. He prints it out. He runs it through Google Translate just to make sure that the Pope's going to be able to understand it. And he goes to the celebration where the Pope's going to be, and the Pope happens to be right in front of him. And so he has his huge sign, and this is what it looks like. Welcome, potato. Does anyone understand what's going on here? So, so in Spanish, the word for Pope is el Papa. And in Spanish also, the word for potato is papa. So it's the same word. So in Google Translate, it was the way to say welcome Pope got translated into welcome potato. So this is happening on Remind. And so we know that's a problem, right? We don't want teachers and administrators to be having this sort of mistranslation. But we wanted to really deeply understand the places that we could improve Remind's translation feature before jumping to a solution. So we worked with our data science team and our user researcher at the time, Jordan Smith. It's right there in the audience. Shout out Jordan Smith. And we were trying to find some extreme users of our translation feature. So teachers and administrators that were using translation every day, much more than the average user. So we emailed them and we set up 30-minute video interviews with 9 of them. They were from all across the United States. And we learned so much. And I'm just going to share a few of the things that we learned. One of the things is that Google Translate isn't always bad. So we heard from Tara, who's a kindergarten teacher in a high poverty school in Kentucky. So she has 25 students, and she speaks to the parents of her students in 7 different languages using Remind. So that is a huge win, right? That she wouldn't be able to do that without Remind. But at the same time, sometimes Google Translate can be very, very bad. So we heard from Alex, who's a school administrator in Washington. And he sent out a message to the parents in his district saying that there had been a head-on collision near one of the schools. And so there might be a little bit more traffic. Just kind of give parents a heads up if their commute times would be a little bit different, right? In Russian, it got translated to there being a dismembered head outside of the school on the road. So not exactly the message that Alex was going for. We also heard from Emily from this minority majority district where there isn't a single language spoken by more than 50% of families. So they were sending out a bunch of, one message with a bunch of different languages in it, and that wasn't working for them. That didn't really feel like an equitable solution to their communication. And there were so many other great insights that we learned from this research project, and we're still in the process of synthesizing them. But the main thing that we learned was that our translation feature is worth revisiting, right? I want to share a few of the initial concepts just so you can get an idea of where we're going with it. One idea is to let Remind users themselves choose their preferred language setting and automatically translate those messages that come into them. So this would let Emily, who's in that minority-majority district, to send out one message and everybody would receive the message in their preferred language. So that would be great, right? But we're still gonna get welcome potatoes, right? So that doesn't solve that. So one of the things that we learned in research is that districts have professional translators on staff. So if Remind allows folks to see which languages their messages are being sent, or which languages the recipients of those messages speak, and then they can modify certain of the translations done by Google, then we can minimize the dismembered head situation from happening ever again. But these are just ideas, right? It's a super complex problem space. If this is something that's interesting to you, we are hiring for product designers and researchers. So come join us in doing this work. But even after we ship solutions to these, it's not done, right? Inclusivity is not a checkbox, and revisiting is an important part of the process. So when you're thinking about how to design more inclusively, again, think about those 3 questions. So the first 2 are you might have an answer to these right now, right? You know what the mission of your company is or your product, and you generally know who you're designing for. Because this third one's a little bit trickier, I want to offer 3 ideas for getting started. The first is to think about what you're uniquely positioned to address given the nature of your product. So Remind is an app, and it has to do with communication. So technology and language were 2 obvious areas to start. The second one is about designing for the extremes. So if we can meet the needs of our power users, so for us, that was folks communicating in multiple languages every day, we're going to be closer to meeting the needs of the average user. And finally, it's never over. Inclusivity is not a checkbox. And the most important part of the process is right when you get to the end, is to start again at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Aiden. And a round of applause for all the speakers. Thank you guys so much. It takes a lot of work and preparation. We met up last week to practice, and everyone's really busy. So thank you guys so much, or thank you all for helping us and bringing everyone together. Now we're going to go into Q&A. And so we're going to invite the speakers up here. So get ready to ask your questions.
So for the folks online, we can't field any of your questions, but we will repeat the question that y'all ask so that the folks online can hear. So does anyone have any questions for our speakers? Yeah.
I'll do my best to rephrase your question. It was really great. So the question was along the lines of, is there any sort of approach that we can take to design for essentially everyone? Because the example I showed, for example, is the average user, a user who has like tap inputs, typically in human factors would want something closer to the bottom of the screen. However, I was saying how, well, people relying on assistive inputs would rather that be at the top if it's the most important information to quickly navigate throughout the screen. So unfortunately, there isn't one size fits all, but when we get into like the nitty gritty of accessibility, oftentimes if a solution isn't ideal for, you know, like an average user, then there are steps that we can take to support users with disabilities, which you just do that in a reverse approach, just saying. But one of those methods is to group elements together. So rather than a user individually moving between those thumbnails, that could be grouped as one element. So rather than having to press like 3+ times, it could just be, I move my focus once and it's highlighted all together. And oftentimes that is more efficient for everyone, especially people with screen readers and other assistive technologies. Because if you think of something like the Google Flights interface and you have 1,000 cards of options, that's very tedious to just arrow between. So in those cases, like you want to just group that all together. So if it is best and like you're in a scenario such as driving and you want elements like closer to the bottom of the screen or where people mostly interact, there are other like detailed steps that you can take to make sure it's accessible to everyone. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, in the back.
So I'm wondering if you have any advice on how to make the case and make sure that that moves its way up the priorities, especially in product teams.
I can start with this one. And the question was, and let me know if it's not quite there, but how do you advocate for accessibility and accessibility practices within products, especially in like smaller organizations or startups, where I find that the motto is like move fast and break things, and get that organizational buy-in to include it on the roadmap, et cetera. Is that okay? Great. So for context, the last company I worked at, I was the first product designer for a year and a half and the 40th employee. So I totally get being in that situation. And I think it goes back to one of the things I talked about in my takeaway section, which was translate that need. Why is it important? If you're discussing with an engineer, say, hey, like this is a good practice to do right now. If you don't do this, do you want to wait next year when it's on the roadmap and now you have a year of tech debt? If you look at a product manager, say, instead of spending 6 sprints working on accessibility with engineering, break this down into 5% of the sprint. It has incremental changes towards the code base. And that makes it seem much easier and much less work, even if it's getting things that you want to get done. Product development, as far as my experiences go, like doesn't stop for accessibility, but who says that you can't start baking that into A, the tech debt that you need to relieve, or B, new and existing features. And that's a challenge right now we're facing at Splunk. Like we have this old enterprise tool where we need to catch up, and we also have in parallel a new design system that we're baking in things right the first time, so we don't have to go back and we can learn from our mistakes.
I also think, to add to that, obviously like storytelling is a huge tool, and one of the things I tried to illustrate in my presentation was how we all fall into those situational disabilities. So if you can pull like a heartstring for them that, yeah, this affects you too, because it ultimately does, then I think they'll be more susceptible to listening.
To follow on from that, do you think with the Domino's Supreme Court decision that we're ever going to get to the point where we stop talking about inclusion and equity and we cross that line into it being discrimination?
So the question was, with the Domino's lawsuit, are we ever going to like cross the line from it being this kind of bonus thing that we need to think about to, okay, no, this is actually discrimination? And I think that example illustrates kind of where we're going, right? Like they were literally sued because it was discrimination. And I think that will become more and more prevalent. And I think what that lawsuit does is it makes it easier to get organizational buy-in, because it becomes a liability if you don't have that. So I'm an optimist. So of course I'm going to be like, yes, of course, like it's going to get better. But I think that's like a very concrete example of it becoming something that organizations are going to be like, okay, yes, we care about this, but also we could get sued. So we're actually going to do something about it.
And to know I'm a negative optimist, to answer your question, I don't think it'll ever get that way, so long as we exist in a white, cishet, male, able-bodied Protestant patriarchy and late-stage capitalism, and that's all hard to undo, considering how many centuries, all time it took to get here. However, to Adrian's point, like there's now precedents being set at an institutional level, and now you can ask your company, like, do you want to get sued? And chances are the answer is going to be no. And then that becomes kind of fuel to the fire, because you can say like, hey, let's do a proactive measure so we never have to be in the position that Domino's was or that other companies were. I chose Domino's because I think that was like 6 weeks ago or something. But you can look up like all these lawsuits that have happened for similar reasons where there just wasn't accessibility, especially if, I'm working for the city. Have federal and state regulations that you need to comply with, or else people are out of job or people can sue.
Yeah.
I have a tactical question. I'm interested to hear what each of you think or can identify as the next steps for contributors, writers, designers, developers, and also next steps for inclusive design and accessibility.
So the question was, what are some like actionable next steps that not just designers can do, but a bunch of different like writers, developers. You listed a bunch of them, but I already forgot them. But what are some like small actionable next steps? Is that what? So next steps for the industry, like like people that are like part of the inclusivity industry, and contributors specifically.
Okay, I'll go. I don't know if I can divide it into each role, like writers, etc. However, I think it's important to actually get the conversation started. And I know that's a bit cliche, but oftentimes no one wants to hear that our industry is not diverse. Like people just want to avoid it altogether. And like as a woman of color, when I bring it up, it's kind of that like, oh, she's a broken record. So until people who maybe aren't diverse can start to introduce this conversation to their colleagues, then that's when we'll actually see change. And in terms of like the accessibility industry, we need to start designing and contributing with people that have diverse abilities, or in other words, a disability. I have a friend who is deaf, and he said that no one would ever give him an interview. So he stopped putting down that he was deaf, because why should he have to even tell anyone that? But then he started getting interviews, of course. And then they were extremely annoyed that he had an interpreter come to his interviews, because they don't have interpreters at companies. So we just need to change the industry as a whole by inviting those people to the table.
I have a bit of a different perspective because my talk was less focused on product and more on kind of the upstream parts of recruiting and diversity. I think the biggest thing is honestly setting precedents for yourself to offer mentorship. I think that, you know, I come from an organization called Inneract Project, and we do a lot of work in the community, and we build a lot of relationships with people of color, and that's honestly really, really tough work. And so we're 2 full-time employees, I want to say like 7 very dedicated volunteers, and it is hard shit out there. It honestly is so much work, and I would love to see more people, you know, if you want to volunteer with us, feel free to come find me after. But, you know, I would love to see more people involved because I think it's really important work that we're doing. And I think that one of the biggest things I think about is my role in this community. And being a part of this community means investing in the community. And I think it's very easy for us to get swept away in the easiness of being a person who works in tech. You know, we have a lot of people who are local transplants. You know, it's easy for us to say, like, going to be here for 3 years, kickstart my career, and I'm out of here. But everyone who's here and present, you know, we get left behind then. So I would say mentorship is a really big piece of this.
You can't get more actionable than that. Volunteer for Inneract Project. It's easy. So specifically about our aging population. So the question was any stories or examples specifically about our aging population in terms of accessibility or inclusion. I have one. If this is kind of a freebie for Remind, but because we support text messages. A lot of phones have a lot of built-in accessibility features for their native text app. So an example of what my parents do is their eyes are starting to work less well, right? And so they have their screen set to like huge text. That helps them. It's like a very small example.
I also think just generally like supporting multiple input and output modalities is important because some people might not be able to see the screen, so they would prefer to speak, but my grandma's Puerto Rican, so that might not work for her because it can't understand her accent, for example. So just understanding how people like interact with your technology and what is the entry point for them. But also just consider how we're all aging, so whatever you design helps us all.
Any other questions? If not, we still have some snacks and drinks to drink. So stick around. We'll probably wrap up in the next 30 minutes. So stick around, talk to some folks. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.